Hi guys, welcome to Deconstructing the Culture. This is a special episode with Porter Goodman. He is very, very smart, very intelligent. I'm super excited to bring him here to you today to give you guys more of a background on this Syria stuff going on. It's all over in the news, and I know you've seen it, and I know you've wondered, why do we care, and what does this mean? We know that Jim Mattis just left office, and we've heard all the news about him and his resignation letter, and we're wondering, what does this mean? Where do we side? We've also seen a lot of political leaders on one side or the other. We've seen Lindsey Graham be highly critical, and then we've seen others be very supportive, and we're not quite sure what this means. So that's why I brought Porter in. Porter has had a lot of experience in all of this. One of the things that really qualifies him, I'm going to actually give you a little bit of his bio because he is one sharp tack, and you're going to understand here in just a minute why he has such firsthand insider information on this. So Porter first became familiar with the Kurdish people while deployed to Iraq with the United States Army from 2006 to 2007. His interest in the Kurds grew enormously during the Syrian civil war, during which Kurdish fighters resisted conquest by ISIS. They took control of northern Syria and established a new experiment in democracy called the Democratic Confederalism. Confederalism? Did I say that right?
That's correct.
Okay, great. In January of 2016, so a couple years ago, after months of research, this man, let me tell you, he decided to purchase a plane ticket. He flew from Salt Lake City, where he lives, to northern Iraq, met with a contact there, and was smuggled across the border into northern Syria, where he joined the Syrian Democratic Forces. You guys, this man has guts. He became so passionate about this after reading about it and following it, he decided to get himself a plane ticket and get his butt over there, get smuggled in. Let me tell you, that is bravery. I could never do that, just saying. From there, after 6 months while working as a combat medic during the military operation to liberate the city of I don't know how to say this, correct me.
You know, everyone says it differently, but Manbij is fine.
Manbij, okay. From there, he was helping to liberate it from ISIS control. He was injured in an explosion which killed fellow American Levi Shirley. While still unconscious from the blast, he became under the care of the U.S. Special Operation Forces medics, who then arranged for his transport out of Syria. Since returning home from Syria, he married the love of his life and is working as a software developer in Provo, Utah, which with his background, that seems very tame. I'm kind of shocked that you're not more in it, but actually I am. I know that you're still in it. You're still following it. You're still speaking about it. You're still passionate about it. Porter was telling me just before we came on that he is actually currently going to high schools and talking to high school students and other groups about why the Syrian conflict matters and how America plays into all that. So that's why I'm going to actually bring this to you now. I'm going to kind of give you the reins a little bit here, Porter. Tell me a little bit about what Donald Trump, we know that he recently announced to the United States that we are pulling our troops out of Syria. And like I said, there's a lot of people on both sides of that. Where do you fall on that issue and why?
I was pretty alarmed when I heard Donald Trump saying that we're going to withdraw from Syria. I'm definitely on the side. I disagree with his decision. I think that U.S. troops are vital to what's going on in Syria. But I know that there's a lot of perspectives, and I know that there's a lot of concerns out there, especially, the United States has had involvement in so many wars in the Middle East, and it's not always had very positive results, and people don't want to spend American lives and American dollars on conflicts that seem fruitless. Mm-hmm. However, now might be a good time to speak to some of the misconceptions about the U.S. troop presence in Syria. So there is a misconception that the U.S. troops on the ground in Syria are fighting a war there. That's a little bit misleading. U.S. troops provide support to Kurdish fighters in Syria in their operations against ISIS. But they're not generally involved in fighting themselves. And so the cost of having troops in Syria has been pretty low, and casualty rates have been extremely low. I think
so just to recap, a lot of people think we're actively fighting a war there, but we're really not. We're just providing support, and we're also really coming together with the Kurdish people to fight against ISIS, which we all are against. No one here in America, at least not conservatives, we don't have fond feelings towards ISIS.
Right. That's exactly right. Another misconception um, is that we are nation building in Syria, which is not the case. Actually, by the time U.S. troops had arrived in Syria, the Syrian Kurds in northern Syria, where we have a troop presence, they had already established a functioning democracy. They'd already stabilized northern Syria. It was safe for NGOs, for journalists, for observers, for human rights groups. Everybody, it's a pretty safe country to go to, which I mean, that's why I felt it was safe enough for me to go there myself. And,
Even though you had to be smuggled in.
well, I had to get over the border.
Okay. Okay.
Once I was over the border, northern Syria, where the Kurds control, is actually very safe. I've wandered city streets by myself, talked to people. Generally, I just had positive interactions with people. I mean, they all knew that I had come there to help them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been the experience of there's a lot of other foreign volunteers who traveled to Syria like I did, and that's been their experience. And U.S. troops who have been deployed to northern Syria, they are pretty secure because the people appreciate their presence. And so it's been a really friendly environment for Westerners, for U.S. forces.
Okay. And so how does the U.S. military pulling out of Syria, how does that affect the Kurds? And then actually pause on that real quick. For those of you who may not be following this, and this was me not too long ago, I'm so sorry. My Echo Dot is talking to me. That's super creepy. For those of you who may not be following, the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Porter, the way I understand it is that about 7 years ago in 2011, that there was, it's not super clear what happened, but there became a civil war in Syria, and it branched off into 4 different groups. And remind me what those groups I know is the government, ISIS, the Kurds, and the rebels.
That's correct.
Okay, and I don't know who the rebels are. Explain to me who the rebels are.
Originally, the rebels just consisted of, I mean, that was the original. There was a popular uprising against the Assad regime, and the people uprising against the Assad regime became known as the rebels, and then it was the rebels and regime originally.
Okay.
That's what the conflict was. But then
and they're uprising because the government became extremely oppressive, very, very corrupt, and the people just had enough. So that's how that originally, or it happened. And then from there, where we are currently today is we stand in support of the Kurds. And to my understanding, it is largely due to the fact that they established a government that is much freer. And we as Americans would like to see free governments established in other countries.
Yeah, that's
and correct me if I have any of that wrong.
Yeah, that's largely true. It had a lot more to do with the fact that the Kurds were the only group really taking the fight to ISIS. The rebels were too focused on the regime. They didn't want to use their resources to fight against ISIS. They wanted to fight against the regime. The West was looking for years for a group to support in this conflict because the West tends to dislike the Assad regime. But they couldn't find. They had trouble finding groups that they could justify supporting because a lot of the rebels became pretty extreme and brutal. The Kurds, however, were not extreme, were not brutal. They espoused a lot of Western values, and so it was safe for the United States to start providing them with support directly.
Okay. And so what is this move by Donald Trump today? I know you mentioned that you don't support it. Why? What happens?
So there's 2 main things that happen. Once the United States withdraws from Syria, first of all, ISIS has not been defeated yet. It's pretty close. It's getting pretty close. They don't have a lot of territory left, but they still have a couple thousand fighters, and they're really good fighters. And it's taken really the combination of Kurdish fighters and U.S. air support in order to drive ISIS back this far. And if that air support ends, which my understanding is that the air support was also going to end, and if that air support ends and U.S. forces are no longer supporting the Kurds, then it's very likely actually that ISIS will see this as a victory over the West. That is a huge boost for their recruitment propaganda. They might start to get another flood of volunteers coming in to support them, and they could start taking ground again and be a serious problem. So that's one thing that happens if the United States withdraws. The other thing is that Turkey would like to invade northern Syria and crush the Kurds, dismantle their democratic institutions, and just maintain control of northern Syria. And so that means that the Kurds would have to redeploy forces away from the fight against ISIS in order to defend against Turkey, and it means that likely they would be defeated by Turkey if the West didn't intervene.
Wow. Wow. So we're looking at two fronts that they have to fight when we pull out, both against ISIS and Turkey, and that essentially spells disaster for any free government there. That's correct. Wow. What else should we know about this?
So much.
I know.
I think it's important that people understand what exactly the Kurds have built in northern Syria. So when the Kurds took control of northern Syria, they were already kind of in the midst of their own ideological revolution. And so when they took up arms and they took control of northern Syria, they already had plans in place, and they already knew what they wanted to implement. And so they implemented democratic confederalism, which is it's a democratic government where power is concentrated at the community level. That means that members of the community, they come together for community meetings, and they make all the decisions for their community. And communities coordinate together. They send representatives to higher councils, and communities coordinate together for common defense and for larger projects. It means there is sort of a centralized government, but it has almost no power. It's basically just there to coordinate the efforts of communities.
Wow, that is incredible. And they organize that themselves from basically chaos.
That's right.
That is amazing.
It is amazing. I mean, this is the brightest light to come out of this awful war. And so some important things about democratic confederalism, it addresses the greatest fundamental issues facing the Middle East. So if I can list off some of those fundamental issues.
Yeah, tell me.
The Middle East is plagued with sectarian strife. That means different ethnic groups are constantly fighting against each other. You have the Sunnis, the Shias. There are a lot of minority groups, like the Kurds are a major minority group. Mm-hmm. There are Yazidis, there are Christian minorities, and different ethnic groups. They've just been oppressing each other for centuries. And when one group falls out of power, another group gains power, then they get their revenge and they visit oppression on everyone else. Well, when the Kurds took power, they'd been oppressed for 100 years, but they didn't take that opportunity to get revenge on anyone else. Instead, they said, okay, every community is going to govern itself, and we're just going to work together to try and build a society, build a free, thriving society.
Very admirable.
Right. And what it did was it started to heal that sectarian strife. It started to heal the divides between the different ethnic groups of northern Syria. And so now all the different ethnic groups in northern Syria are working together. They're all fighting together against ISIS and to defend the territory that they've been able to liberate.
Wow. So it tamed down all the terrible feuding between all these ethnic groups, and then they all came together against a common enemy, which is also our enemy, ISIS. That is incredible. And so us pulling out of there is just, it not only leaves them open and vulnerable to Turkey and ISIS, but now it potentially leaves that space for the feuding to continue or to start up again.
That's right. And you constantly see efforts by Turkey to reignite conflict between the different ethnic groups of northern Syria, because they don't want to see the Kurds succeed there.
Because it doesn't benefit them if they're united, then Turkey can take control.
Right. So some other issues that the Kurds are solving. So because there is no centralized government, because there's no concentration of power, that really eliminates, it leaves almost no room for corruption to take place, which is another one of the fundamental issues in the Middle East. You have concentration of power, and it just leads to corruption. Well, there's not much room for it where the Kurds have taken control. So that's another issue that their system addresses. Another issue is the religious persecution. The Kurds have always been one of the more moderate ethnic groups in the Middle East. So they've always just kind of been more religiously tolerant. But they're really pushing that in the areas that they've been able to liberate. And so, I mean, I can show you a lot of, well, that's maybe a tangent. we could talk a lot about examples of the Kurds and their religious tolerance and how they've extended themselves to protect religious minorities, and to make a place that's safe for everyone to worship as they desire. And then a final thing that the Kurds have achieved, and I think this is maybe the greatest achievement of theirs in northern Syria, is that the Kurds are really pushing women's rights, which is a big deal in the Middle East because women have been oppressed there for millennia.
Yes. And not only is it the culture, but it's the religion to oppress women. And I love that you brought that up, Porter, and I'm going to let you continue, but I just want to point out that this is a prime example of where feminism, original feminism, is actually needed, and then that's to bring equal rights to women. And it drives me nuts, and my tribe and I talk about this all the time, how the feminists here in America just go nuts over the craziest, littlest, dumbest things, where true feminism and equality for women is needed in places over here like Syria. And so the Kurds are bringing that. Tell me about that.
Right. So the Kurds, when they took control and they implemented democratic confederalism, they didn't decide that they should just take baby steps. I mean, they just took a giant leap and said, women have equal rights to men, and they enforced it. And so the ways that they did that is, for one, they armed women. So
really? Okay, then that's pretty big. What is it that the quote, the cult made all women equal? God made men and women, then the cult made them equal.
Yeah. Well, there it's the AK-47, but yeah.
All right, then. That was probably better.
Yeah. So in northern Syria, it's just part of their system. Every level of civilian and military leadership is co-led by a man and a woman. So that's the way that they're enforcing it. And so military units co-led by men and women. Towns are co-mayored by men and women. I mean, everything it's always co-led by men and women. And that's their way of just, because the patriarchy there is so entrenched. And I know patriarchy is like a buzzword. And it's,
to feminists it is, which I'm not. I don't profess to be a feminist, but I really think that is super fascinating. If they had to get radical to get rid of that radical patriarchy, because I don't think it would ever really be necessary or needed to have a co-leadership between men and women here in America, because I think women are already equalized. But going into this place, them taking those kind of steps because it's such a radical environment, them taking radical steps to make women equal is so admirable. That's incredible. I mean, and we don't hear about that on the news. Why don't we hear about that, here in America on the news more often? That's incredible.
It's in the news, but it's generally not it's not front page news generally.
Okay.
But yeah, and I agree with you. I think that's exactly what's necessary. This kind of enforcement is exactly what's necessary in a place as extreme as the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually it'll reach a point where the most sexist thing going on is enforcing like co-leadership by men and women. But for now, like, I think it's important to swing things back, toward equality. About 40% of the militias there are women, and a lot of these are girls who are 16 to 20. And
young.
They're doing a lot of the fighting. And so it was great working with them. They're always smiling, Like, you can ask them why they're happy, and they'll just tell you, like, they grew up thinking that all their life was going to be a life of servitude. Wow. That they were going to serve their parents until they got married, and they would serve their husbands the rest of their lives. And they didn't have, just the world was not open to them. And then this conflict comes along, and the women's militias rise up, and they're actually defeating ISIS and liberating territory, and women who are joining the YPJ and being trained, in these all-female military units these women are free, and the whole world is suddenly open to them, and they can do anything. And it's hard to take that kind of freedom away because they have guns. And there's actually an incredible article in the New York Times about some of the just how incredible the changes have been in northern Syria from this traditional, like, Sharia law, tribal patriarchy to the way things work now. And it's like a really difficult adjustment for a lot of like tribal men in northern Syria, but the
You'll have
women
to
are
send that
just,
to me. I'll add it to the notes for our
yeah,
listeners. We'll add that to the show notes so people can check that article out. That's pretty cool.
definitely. And that article is like near and dear to my heart because it's actually an article about the changes in Manbij, Syria, which is where I was fighting with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and that's
Okay.
where I was injured. And so to see how much better things have gotten there for women is like,
Ah,
it's just
it's amazing.
incredible.
That's so incredible. So, if you don't mind me asking, if I'm sure our listeners are curious, because I did mention that there was a blast and you were injured. Can you tell us what was that like? That's kind of a weird question. I'm sure you've probably heard it before. What's it like to be blown up? That
So
sounds super bad for me to say it like that, but
the funny thing is, I can't actually answer that question very well because my memory cut off. So there was a bomb that was hidden, like I probably under some floor tiles inside of a house. Actually, it wasn't out in the open, and so I entered a house behind another American, um, and the last thing I remember is stepping through the doorway, and so I probably lost like 30 seconds to a minute of memory before the blast. I just don't. It My memory just cuts off,
wow,
and
okay.
I woke up naked on an operating table on a U.S. military base.
That's
And
mortifying.
right, and so and it wasn't even clear to me what exactly had happened. I mean, it was days before I learned that Levi Shirley had been killed.
Oh,
Um, I just didn't know what happened. It was a complete memory blackout.
wow.
So I don't know what it's like to be blown up.
Okay.
um, I
Wow.
yeah.
So were
So
you and Levi close, the gentleman who died in that blast?
actually, we weren't very close. I knew him. He was an acquaintance. I met him actually when I was in Iraq. Me and him were actually smuggled over the border together
Okay.
into Syria. But then we kind of parted ways. Initially in Syria, I was working kind of on the civilian side. I was supporting like the democratic institutions there in various ways. And then later, I ended up going in and working with the Syrian Democratic Forces directly when the
Mm.
Manbij operation started. And so when I entered Manbij, we'd been working on the outskirts for a while. And one day, me and another medic, we went inside the city to a part that the Kurds had taken control of, and I ran into him there, and
Mm.
he was killed the next day.
Oh, that's so
So
heartbreaking for his family too. For him to
absolutely.
go just like you for such an honorable cause as a volunteer. I mean, so incredibly brave, but I'm sure for his family that was really heartbreaking. But I'm sure they are so proud of him.
Right.
I know it's no
Well,
consolation for losing family, but
yeah. Well, and articles like this New York Times article that shows like how much change has come in Manbij. Um, I mean, women have equal rights there, and years only a few years ago it was controlled by ISIS, which was the most oppressive and
oh,
brutal group. And so articles like this are just, yeah,
breath
are
of
just
fresh air.
like I said, near and dear to my heart.
Vindication. Vindication. That's amazing. Wow. So, a couple more questions, and then I think we're about out of time, but we're for sure having you back on to hear more about what's going on because this is such a deep and wide issue as
Sure.
as we've been talking about. The first one is there any kind of call to action? Is there something that people should be aware of, an organization, something that they can do to somehow support this? I'm not sure. What can the average American do?
Well, I would like to see the average American learning more about the Kurds and understanding the situation there better. I don't necessarily want people to take my word for it. I want you to go and find out what exactly is happening there. And that's hard because it's a big issue and it's really complicated. Uh, but learn more about the Kurds and what they've achieved. And learn more about what's going on in Turkey. Actually, what's going on in Turkey is kind of at the root of why this is such a huge issue. I mean, Turkey is a NATO ally. You know, if they weren't if they weren't threatening to invade northern Syria, then there would be no issue with pulling troops out.
Mm-hmm.
So learn what's going on with our NATO ally Turkey, what that Turkey has, or what that country has shifted to become like.
Mm.
Um, and but as far as a call to action, um,
Can we
uh,
maybe reach out to, I know Donald Trump has a call-in hotline. Can we maybe call and apply some pressure and say, hey, Trump, we're not actually a fan of this. We'd like to keep our military there. Would that be something that you feel like would be helpful?
Right, that kind of thing would be good. Also, calling congressmen and senators and asking them to pursue this. So, Senator Lindsey Graham, in the past couple of days, issued a call for a congressional hearing, which would, the purpose of that congressional hearing would be to answer the questions: what will happen to the Kurds once the United States withdraws, and what will happen to ISIS once the United States withdraws. And I think those are exactly the questions that the answers to those questions, that's what everyone needs to understand in order to make a decision on this. And so calling senators and congressmen and asking them to pursue this, to see that this congressional hearing takes place. The experts are lined up that will explain exactly like what we can predict will happen in Syria and what is at stake. I think that's really important for potentially reversing this decision.
Agreed. Agreed. Absolutely. All right, Porter, for those of you who may be listening, who may have questions for you or else would like to have you come speak at an event or their school, how can they reach you? Do you have social media or an email?
That's a good question. So I have a Facebook page, and you can message me on Facebook. I have a personal page, and I have like a public page where I share
Goodman?
things about Syria. Yeah, it's just Porter Goodman. It's just under my name.
Okay.
So that might actually be a great place if anyone wants to contact me. If you want more material, I have a lot of sources that I can link you to. There have been countless articles written about the situation in the Middle East, every facet of it, from the PKK in Turkey to Turkish Erdogan becoming basically a Turkish dictator to, I mean, everything. There's a lot going on here.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, Porter. This was so enlightening. And my final question for you is, do you have any plans to go back to Syria?
Well, like you said in the beginning, I am now married to the love of my life. She won't let me go back.
You know what? I got to side with her just a little bit. As a newlywed myself, my husband and I got married about 1.5 years ago. I don't think I'd be real excited about him being smuggled to a country that is having some strife right now. So, all right. Thank you so much again. God bless you. God bless what you're doing and the message that you're bringing to Americans and to the world. And we'll keep in touch. We'll have you on again soon.
Awesome. Thank you. I look forward to it.